Mark Loiseau, the president of Controlled Demolition Incorporated, told the American Free Press that in the basements of the World Trade Center, where 47 central support columns connected to the bedrock, hot spots of literally molten steel were discovered more than a month after September 11th. These incredibly hot areas were found at the bottoms of the elevator shafts, down 7 basement levels. The molten steel was found 3, 4, and 5 weeks later when the rubble was being removed. He said that molten steel was also found at World Trade Center 7. The highest temperature was in the east corner of the South Tower, where a temperature of 1,377 degrees Fahrenheit was recorded. The molten steel in the basement was more than double that temperature.
As if explosive residue in the dust was not enough, there are other disturbing aspects of the Twin Towers' collapse. Both the North and South Tower collapsed at nearly free-fall speed, 110 stories, reducing itself to a pile of twisted steel and pulverized concrete and building materials in approximately 10 seconds. The Twin Towers combined contained almost 500,000 tons of concrete. This was turned into particles the size of talcum powder, blanketing lower Manhattan in a fine dust. It also turns out that molten metal exceeding 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit was discovered in the rubble of Ground Zero, underneath the Twin Towers and Building 7. Firefighters, emergency workers, police, officials, even Rudy Giuliani testified to these massive temperatures. Even after heavy rain on September 14th and 21st, a constant stream of fire retardants and water described as creating a giant lake. These fires were not put out until December 13th, 2001, making it the longest burning structural fire in history. If one were going to bring down the Twin Towers in a controlled manner, you would have to simultaneously sever the 47 central support columns at the base of the building. Maybe that's why a large number of eyewitnesses reported massive explosions at the base of the Twin Towers, some before the planes had even impacted the building. In fact, large amounts of white smoke appear at the base of the South Tower just minutes before its collapse.
That were burning in these towers was a dark gray, a heavy, almost black gray smoke coming off. This implies an oxygen-starved fire.
Nevertheless, 55 minutes later, the whole tower collapses. According to the official NIST version of events, at a certain point, the steel structure of the towers gave way. It no longer had the structural strength that it had at the beginning. And all of this was supposed to be because of the immense heat. And here is something difficult to explain. We know that at some point certain people managed to walk down from the top of this tower and cross the point where the fire was strongest. Somehow they reached the bottom of the tower. How did they manage to do that?
I don't know. When I looked down there, I didn't see flames. I just sensed that it was the right thing to go and try and test it. We would go as far as we could until we were stopped by flames. And when we came to the 78th floor, the last layer was standing, but it was cracked. And there were flames licking up the other side of the wall like this. It wasn't a roaring inferno. I sensed that the flames were maybe starved for oxygen right there, you know, in the interior. We kept going, and we got onto the 74th floor. When we got down that far, normal conditions. The lights were on, fresh air coming up from below.
So the temperature inside the building was not particularly high, as we can see from the presence of this woman who is standing at the precise point where the plane impacted. In order to verify the way the buildings collapsed and how the heat had affected the steel, NIST commissioned numerous tests, some of which were conducted by a company called Underwriters Labs.
And Kevin Ryan He's the former employee from Underwriters Laboratories who challenged the NIST report and went public with it. And within a week, he was fired from his job.
We did test the floor models in August of 2004. And those tests disproved the primary theory behind the collapses of buildings. It was called the pancake theory. The floors would collapse upon each other into a stack of pancakes, and then the columns were no longer supported and the columns would fall apart. Well, the floor models didn't collapse in the tests, and these were in furnaces, testing furnaces, much hotter temperature, longer periods of time. They still didn't collapse. So, a few months later, the government put out an update on their report. And they stated not only that the floors did not collapse, but they had done tests on the few samples they had saved from the fire zones. And those tests proved that the temperatures were very low. Temperatures were not hot enough to even soften steel. And yet, they're coming out with a summary statement that says that's what actually did happen, that the floors did collapse and the steel did soften. So they either downplayed those results or ignored those results, and they ended up putting it all in a computer.
Thanks to computers, NIST managed to straighten this problem out, and the old pancake theory was replaced by the inward bowing theory. According to the Institute, the heat weakened the floors, which started to curve downwards. The external walls of the towers also curved inwards until they could no longer bear the weight of the structures above, causing the towers to collapse.
Their final theory is almost entirely computer-based. And the computer itself is not really accessible. They haven't given it to us to examine. After having investigated it more over the last year and a half, I found that yes, they did contradict their test results, but additionally they also did manipulate the test parameters. They doubled one thing, they cut something else in half. For example, their story says that aircraft combustibles are at 13 tons in the aircraft cabin. The FAA says it's more like an average of 6.5 tons. It's double. So they double it. They double the time that their computer model exposes columns to fire, 90 minutes instead of what we know is 45 or 50 minutes in both of the buildings, actually. And they double it. They cut something else in half. And they double it.
One of the things that particularly struck me was the incredible speed with which the towers came down. There was something truly inexplicable about the speed of the collapse. If we dropped a weight from a height of around 400 meters, which was the height of the towers, the time it would take to reach the ground, supposing that there was not even any air resistance to slow down the speed of the fall, would take approximately 9 seconds.
It took about 8 or 10 seconds for the whole tower just to go straight down.
The impact was at about 2/3 of the way up the tower. Even if the section above collapsed suddenly due to the structure giving way, and even considering that the impact of the section above was enormous and therefore in some way weakened the resistance of the structures below, it is clear that, due to the resistance of the undamaged part below, this tower should not have fallen at such a speed. But it fell as if there was nothing below it, whereas there was an enormous structure below, a resistant structure that should have slowed down the speed of the collapse considerably. Here, close to the two towers, there was another large tower, which was hit by the debris from the tower that collapsed.
This building, this huge, it was this 47-story building, was never hit by a jet. And yet it came down that same day, but 7 hours after the last tower fell 7 hours later.
That I could literally just turn my head and there it was with the building burning. I was with my friend Jim Lecce. We watched everything out the window. He was fixated taking photographs, and whenever I mentioned leaving, he never wanted to leave. He said to me, "This is history. Don't you realize we are watching history happen? We're part of history. Why would we leave?" I was in the kitchen. I was in my kitchen. I had flowers in my hand, and the building starts coming down. Our windows blew in. He came running across the apartment. "Get out of here, the building is coming down." Well, it sounded like it was coming down on us. That cloud, there was a debris cloud created by when the Tower 2 fell. It created a debris cloud which became part of our life because it just burst in our window at 50 miles an hour. That whole cloud just came bursting in, and many people were wanting to investigate whether the collapses were actually controlled demolitions, as many people thought on the very day. Even the news commentators thought they were controlled demolitions. So there was a lot of controversy about whether they were or not. And friends of mine that knew that I had the dust were also knew a scientist, Stephen Jones, at BYU.
My name is Dr. Stephen Jones. I have a PhD in physics from Vanderbilt University, 1978. I have a Bachelor of Science degree from Brigham Young University, 1973. I graduated magna cum laude. I went after PhD work. I did postdoctoral work at Los Alamos Maison Physics Facility. In June 2007, I was examining a dust sample, which I'd obtained from Jeanette McKinley. I was using a loupe and also just looking at it with my eyes and an ordinary optical microscope, although stereo, so that I could see better in 3 dimensions. And what I found was a chip that looked like it might be a paint chip. I mean, early on I was thinking maybe not too interesting, but this chip was rather striking in its appearance. It had an orange-red color, first of all, and then I found several of these, and they all had some gray material adhering to the side of the red material. So layered. Later we found multiple layers, but most of these chips have 2 layers, red, gray. I did take one of these chips then to the electron microscope, the scanning electron microscope, and we looked at it with the electron microscope, and then we used a system where we could determine the elements. What we found in the red material is a combination of aluminum and iron oxide, and these are the components of thermite. Of course, now we looked with an electron microscope, we looked deeper and deeper, a higher and higher magnification. And I pulled in a colleague of mine, Dr. Jeffrey Ferrer. He's an expert on the electron microscope machine. So he actually broke a piece off of one of these red chips, and then later he did 4 different samples, broke a piece off. That gives you a fresh surface. Because in the dust, there's all sorts of stuff. There's zinc and titanium and calcium, all sorts of stuff. So he broke off a tip, you see, so we could look at a fresh surface. And then what you see in all 4 samples that we studied in this detail: carbon, which is significant, oxygen, iron, and aluminum. We looked at this, and these again are the ingredients, except for the carbon. And we found that experimenters working with superthermite, trying to beef it up, make it more explosive, tailoring it to different weapons applications, they would have silicon in there and an organic material, which means a carbon. So a polymer such as Viton, they would add to this to give it the properties they wanted. So that fit. Now, see, that was surprising to me to see silicon and carbon, but then we find in the literature that's what these guys are doing in the weapons labs, Livermore and Los Alamos. They're adding organic, because that gives you a gas production. When the thermite goes off, now you also have gas production, which gives you the explosive force, for instance. I suggested that we take a sample of this red-gray chip material and run it through a very sensitive instrument called a differential scanning calorimeter. And he did that. What it does, you heat the temperature slowly, and a material will react if it's going to. And if it reacts and produces heat, you'll get a spike in your calorimeter. And then if it reacts quickly, it'll be a narrow spike. If it, say, burns over a long period of time, you'll see a big broad spike. And the total area there is the total amount of energy released, and it gives you a lot of information. What we found, what Dr. Farrer found first, and he was real excited when he told me about this, he took one of these chips and he put it in the differential scanning calorimeter, and sure enough, it went off at right about 430 centigrade, but more importantly, the peak was high, which means a lot of energy released, and narrow, which means, in his terms, it blew up. You know, you say, man, this is it. This stuff blows up. It behaves just like it has the ingredients of nanothermite. He said, well, there should be, in a thermite reaction, you should produce molten iron. So you should see some spheres of iron. Think of spraying water in the air, and you get droplets that are more or less spherical because the surface tension pulls the liquid into a sphere. It's very simple. Same thing with molten iron from the thermitic reaction, whether it's ordinary conventional thermite or this super nanothermite. Either way, you get this molten iron, and you should get these droplets of iron. So we said we got to look for those. You know, if you don't find those, maybe who knows what it is. But we got to find droplets of molten iron. Otherwise, we're not sure we had the thermite reaction, the thermitic reaction. In this case, it's a nanothermite. So we looked, and wow, what a beautiful sight. As you look at this, after the red material is reacted, there are these little spheres, just tons of them. And we compared the traces that we got in this sophisticated calorimeter with traces obtained with known thermite. These are published data, and our peak is actually narrower. I mean, this stuff goes off with very rapidly, and more energy also than had been reported by these other researchers working with known nanothermite.
Molten metal exceeding 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit was discovered in the rubble of Ground Zero, underneath the Twin Towers, and Building 7. Even with heavy rain on September 14th and 21st, a constant stream of fire retardants and water, described as creating a giant lake, these fires would not be extinguished until December 13th, 2001, making it the longest burning structural fire in history. Was the jet fuel responsible? Dr. Frank Gale, who was working with NIST, claimed in 2005, your gut reaction would be that the jet fuel melted the steel. Indeed, it did not. The steel did not melt.
The temperatures that we know existed within the collapse within the debris pile are physically impossible from an atmospheric jet fuel fire. Cannot be done.
I'm curious about the pool of molten steel that was found in the bottom of the towers.
I am too.
And
please tell me about it. Have you seen it?
Well, not personally, but eyewitnesses there found huge pools of molten steel beneath the towers, and some scientists don't think that the collapse of the building could have melted all that steel.
First of all, let's go back to your basic premise that there was a pool of molten steel. I know of absolutely nobody, and no eyewitness who said so, nobody who's produced it. I was on the site, I was on the steel yards, so I don't know that that's so.
You'd get down below and you'd see molten steel running down the channel rails. Like you're in a foundry.
Yeah,
Like lava from a volcano.
Underground, it was still so hot that molten metal dripped down the sides of a wall from Building 6.
However, they do hit hot spots occasionally, and everything stops.
There were fires of 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit below the ground.
I don't know that that's so.
There's video of it.
Melted around 2,600 degrees Fahrenheit. I think it's probably pretty difficult to get that kind of temperatures in a fire.
Well, NASA pictures, thermal images showed those sorts of temperatures in the basement.
Would you send them to me?
Okay.
My name is Mark, and I'm the individual who was questioning Dr. Gross, and he asked me to email to him those thermal images. When I approached him after his talk to get his email address for that purpose, he refused to provide it to me. I think this is important because it reveals the attitude of the NIST investigators, which is one of willful ignorance of what really happened on 9/11.
As well as the molten metal in the debris, it was also observed prior to the South Tower's collapse. Also, a minute and 20 seconds before collapse, large amounts of white smoke begin pouring from the base of the South Tower. 3. The concrete, and in fact, virtually everything except the metal inside the Twin Towers was pulverized as the building collapsed. This pulverized material created pyroclastic dust clouds that raced down city streets, coating lower Manhattan in a fine dust. Pyroclastic clouds generally occur during two events: volcanic eruptions and controlled demolitions. Four, steel beams weighing up to 200,000 pounds were thrown laterally up to 500 feet. A cross-section from the World Trade Center weighing approximately 300 tons was embedded in the southeastern corner of the American Express building. This piece would have had to travel at least 390 feet, maintaining enough kinetic energy to embed itself in the corner of the building.
What we should have seen in the debris pile was a pyramidal shape. If it had been a gravity-driven collapse, we would have seen a roughly pyramidal shape or a conic shape. What we actually did see was a massive ejection of dust and debris and large sections of steel from well away from the towers, tens of meters away from the towers. That's hard to see a reason for that within a gravity-driven collapse.
5. Firefighters and eyewitnesses reported a series of explosions before and during the collapses.
And we heard the noise associated with an implosion.
Secondary explosion on Tower 2.
Some sort of explosive device.
We're obviously having a bit of trouble right now maintaining our location because we just heard one more explosion.
There was another major explosion.
Do you know anything about those extra explosions we heard?
No, I do not.
Were they car bombs?
I have no idea, ma'am.
The street shook, and I heard like an explosion.
Do you know if it was an explosion or if it was a building collapse? To me, it sounded like an explosion. We heard a very loud blast, an explosion. They were taking photographs and securing this area just prior to that huge explosion that we all heard and felt. Not clear now is why this explosion took place. When there was some sort of collapse or explosion,
from street level, as though it had exploded up, a giant rolling ball of flame, and the firefighters screamed, "Run!"
There was this blast of warm air. It wasn't hot. It was warm. And it picked me up and threw me up against the wall of the building.
You were picked up off the ground.
Physically picked up off the ground.
I remember an explosion. At that point, I got knocked out. I don't remember anything. Then I got up, and I looked out the window because the windows exploded, and the street below caved in. And at that point, there was like fireballs coming up.
An hour later than that, we had that big explosion from much, much lower. I don't know what on earth caused that.
15 minutes after they made their entry, we heard a boom. I don't know if that was the infrastructure that was going or another explosion.
Again, there has been a second explosion.
John, just seconds ago there was a huge explosion, and it appears right now the second World Trade Tower has just collapsed.
All of a sudden I heard rumbling and we all started running away from it. The glass like blew out and threw me onto the sidewalk, and I couldn't see for like 20 seconds.
It was like holy hell coming down them stairs. And then when we finally got to the bottom, they were coming out on a mezzanine level there. And another explosion came right from it, just everyone flying.
We stuck on the stairs for a while. We finally got down to the lobby. Then we get to the lobby, it was this big explosion.
So I was real lucky. I don't know what happened to the people behind me when that blast occurred.
And was actually on the 78th floor of the second tower and was evacuating the tower and experienced all these explosions and made his way back down.
We presume because of the initial explosion there may have been secondary explosions as well that were detonated in the building by these terrorists.
There was a secondary explosion, probably a device either planted before or on the aircraft that did not explode until an hour later.
I heard a second explosion and another rumble and more smoke and more dust. I ran inside the buildings, the chandeliers shook, and again, black smoke filled the air. Within another 5 minutes, we were covered again with more silt and more dust. And then a fire marshal came in and said we had to leave because if there was a third explosion, this building might not last.
Eyewitnesses also reported that explosions had taken place in lower levels of both the North and South Tower.
They were having coffee in the World Trade Center when the first plane struck.
And all of a sudden it sounded like, I don't know where the subway is, but it sounded like a subway collision, a bomb, and it was just pounding, boom, 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 and I literally thought the subway had exploded. And
the ladies that are with me were in the World Trade Center in the first building and escaped through the lobby where they report they believe there was a bomb in the lobby.
Just get out of the tunnel and the blue.
The subway tunnel?
Yeah.
Yes, I was right there. I was down in the basement, came down, all of a sudden the elevator blew up, smoke. I dragged the guy out, his skin was hanging off, and I dragged him out, and I helped him out to the ambulance.
And when I got up to the concourse level, it was just like, you know, like gunfire, and then just 3 big explosions.
And even the turnstile was burnt and was sticking up, and they just told us to run.
I heard the first explosion, and the elevator blew up.
And as we were coming out, we passed the lobby. There was no lobby. So I believe the bomb hit the lobby first, and a couple of seconds then the first plane hit.
Firefighter John Schroeder arrived in the lobby of the North Tower shortly after the first plane struck.
So we're standing there in the lobby, we're getting all together. All of a sudden, we hear... I look down to my right, and the elevators exploded, something out of like a Bruce Willis Die Hard movie. People just come running out of the elevators on fire, fireballed. I mean, it was like, what is going on here? Something's up here. I mean, the plane's up there, now there's fire down here. People run around all on fire. This is crazy. So we were heading up to the 24th floor of the stairwell, and all of a sudden we heard, Mayday, Mayday, second plane, second plane. Swift, we're looking at each other like, come on, second plane? There's no way there's a second plane. Within seconds, our building got rocked. We got bounced around in the stairwell like pinballs, man. And we just said, you know what? Time to go. We got down to the lobby, and everything was blown out, exploded. Everything was... And we were the only ones in the lobby now. We're going, wait a second here. Where is everybody? Because the building was coming down the outside. They moved to the command post, the World Trade Center, too. So now we're like, we didn't get no, where is everybody? We were in the lobby. It looks like everything was exploded. Everything was gone. We're like, what is going on here? We didn't know. We were like, this is crazy. But for every window in the lobby to be exploded, I mean, them windows were like as thick as forget it. They were 2-3-inch glasses. You know, come on. They exploded out of the lobby. You know, something. It wasn't from the jet fuel. No way. The elevators exploded. They were down from the lobby. The lobby was over here. That should never have happened. Something would happen there, and that wasn't. We came down. It looked like a bomb went off in the lobby. There was no fire. It just looked like a bomb went off.
So, how was the largest and most puzzling architectural failure in history treated? The steel from the World Trade Center was mostly shipped overseas, eliminating any possibility of independent investigations. New York City's Department of Design and Construction contracted 4 companies for debris removal. Each was assigned a specific zone and controlled and monitored by a 3-person team. The operation was so controlled that in November, each dump truck used for removal of debris was fitted with a GPS locator. One driver took an extended lunch break and was dismissed from the job. By April 2002, over 185,000 tons of debris had been removed from Ground Zero. FEMA's Building Performance Assessment Team was not even granted access to Ground Zero. They were granted a tour of the site in early October, but were forbidden from collecting samples or examining blueprints. Out of hundreds of thousands of pieces of steel, 150 were preserved at Fresh Kills landfill, from where FEMA conducted its investigation. When the Twin Towers came down, they released over 500 tons of pulverized asbestos into Lower Manhattan, along with lead, barium, mercury, chromium, copper, and several other toxic chemicals. 425,000 cubic yards of concrete is pulverized. 600,000 square feet of glass is turned into dust. During the World Trade Center's construction, spray-on fireproofing comprised of concrete and asbestos was placed on the core columns. When asbestos was outlawed in 1971, they ceased this procedure at the 64th floor of the South Tower. The Port Authority eventually realized that the asbestos presented a problem, and demolition was not an option. In 1989, the Port Authority estimated the removal of asbestos from both the World Trade Center and LaGuardia Airport would have cost up to $1 billion. By 2001, the cost for the World Trade Center buildings alone would have met or exceeded $1 billion. This money would sadly not be needed. Although it was clear that the air was not safe to breathe, the public was urged to return to Lower Manhattan. Wall Street opened back up on September 17th, and children were allowed to go back to school. Firefighters, police, and rescue workers were allowed to toil in lethal conditions using paper masks from Home Depot, while government officials walked around in hazmat suits.
My name's John Field. I was hurt at Ground Zero during the cleanup. Wow, I was only there for 5 days before I was horribly injured, and I mean horribly injured. Leading up to that day, every day I was there, I complained that it was an unsafe workplace. Someone's going to get hurt. It just happened to be me. But I let everybody know that someone would get hurt. I was there for 5.5 days. Nobody told me to wear a mask once. Nobody gave a shit when that piece of steel altered my life. But like the thousands that are suffering and sick, I didn't roll over and play dead. And I know human life takes a backseat to the almighty dollar, and that's what makes this country roll and run, is the almighty dollar. But you guys somewhere along the line lost your credibility with me.
The Environmental Protection Agency, under direct orders from the White House, told New Yorkers that the air was safe to breathe. The administrator at the time, Christine Whitman, issued an internal memo on September 12th, declaring that all statements to the media should be cleared through the National Security Council before they are released.
So what happened? The White House changed EPA press releases to add reassuring statements and delete cautionary ones. September 13th, the EPA draft release, never released to the public, says EPA testing terrorized sites for environmental hazards. The White House changes that to EPA reassures public about environmental hazards. September 16th, the EPA draft says recent samples of dust on Water Street show higher levels of asbestos. The White House version? New samples confirm ambient air quality meets OSHA standards and is not a cause for public concern. And the White House leaves out entirely this warning, that air samples raise concerns for cleanup workers and office workers near Water Street. Why all these changes?
We were told that a desire to reopen Wall Street and national security concerns were the reasons for changing the press releases.
Christy Todd Whitman should be in jail for manslaughter. Christy, go to jail. Do not piss. Go. Just go to jail. Lock yourself up. When I said that, everybody said, don't you think that's a little harsh? And I said, no. 6 months later, every politician was saying it. Everybody was saying it like it was like saying hi. I pat myself on the back for having the nerve and the audacity to say that. She took orders from Condoleezza Rice, who took orders from the White House. They knew the air was bad. They lied. You should go to jail for manslaughter. For every time somebody dies. James Zadroga, Don Jones, Tim Keller, my close personal friend who I had to go to his funeral, Officer Borgia, and the many more that have died. I take this personally now. I take it real personal. You got an ex-mayor running for president who claims he helped us. Standing on a pile with a bullhorn, Mr. President and Mr. Giuliani, does not constitute helping anybody. At all.
The EPA's public release assured people that there was no significant level of asbestos in the air, and that instead of evacuating, they could clean their homes with a wet rag. More people will die post 9/11 from these illnesses than died on the day itself. By 2006, 70% of the 40,000 Ground Zero workers had developed respiratory problems. Hundreds of them had developed cancer, and over 80 had died. To make matters worse, a large majority of the victims from the World Trade Center were denied a decent burial and treated like garbage. A pile of approximately 500,000 tons of ash located at Fresh Kills landfill contains 1,148 victims that have yet to be identified. Mayor Bloomberg has repeatedly denied family members' requests, replying, "I've only visited my father's grave once." On top of all of this, human remains were discovered up to 400 feet away from the South Tower, on the roof of the Deutsche Bank building. 300 bone fragments were discovered between April 7th and 14th, 2006, and more are expected to be found. Is all of the above possible with a gravity-driven global collapse? Were the Twin Towers brought down as a result of the airplanes that struck them and the fires that followed? Or were they brought down in a controlled demolition?
All right, some new information coming in. Report from Associated Press of a large plane crashing in western Pennsylvania. This is according to officials at the Somerset County Airport. A large plane crashing in western Pennsylvania.
We had that plane crash. I'm sorry, go ahead, Skip.
Say it again. Repeat, please, Skip.
I'm saying somebody may have made that horrible decision to go ahead and take the plane down.
1984, construction began on World Trade Center Building 7, a 47-story office building, 570 feet tall, and 300 feet away from the North Tower. It opened to the public in 1987 and housed offices for Department of Defense, Securities and Exchange Commission, and the Internal Revenue Service. Building 7 was considered the Central Intelligence Agency's largest station outside of Washington, D.C., and was also the Secret Service's biggest field office. Numerous cases would be closed due to its destruction. On June 8, 1999, Mayor Rudolph Giuliani's Office of Emergency Management Command Center on the 23rd floor is opened.
The command center on the 23rd floor is bulletproof and bomb-resistant, with its own air supply and generators. It's linked to city airports, the Coast Guard, and the Pentagon. Computers will soon have detailed blueprints of every major building in New York City, as well as evacuation routes. Hurricanes and heat waves would be handled here, as well as terrorist attacks. Though New York officials say their facility is not impenetrable, they're confident it could handle even the worst crisis imaginable. Deborah Fayerick for CNN, New York.
The 50,000 square foot center has reinforced, bulletproof, and bomb-resistant walls, its own air supply and water tank, beds and showers, and 3 backup generators. It has countless monitors which oversee police and fire department responses, and it is staffed around the clock. Hours before the first plane would strike the World Trade Center, Building 7's alarm system would be placed on test status at 6:47 a.m. for a scheduled period of 8 hours. This normally occurs during maintenance, and any fire alarms from the building are disregarded. After the second plane strikes the South Tower, the building's power is shut off and its tenants are evacuated. The major fires in World Trade Center 7 were as follows. On the east face, between floors 11 and 12. On the north face, on floors 7 and 12. On the west face, between floors 29 and 30. Smoke obscures the entire south face of the building. By 3 p.m., Chief Daniel Nigro of the FDNY had set up a collapse zone around Building 7. After 4 p.m., news outlets began reporting that the building had collapsed.
We are getting information now that one of the other buildings, Building 7...
It opened to the public in 1987 and housed offices for Department of Defense, Internal Revenue Service,